Hi, I'm Rick Wade, Senior Vice President of Strategic Alliances and Outreach here at the United States Chamber of Commerce. Since our founding, the U.S. Chamber has advocated for policies that help businesses create jobs and to grow our economy. That's what we do best. And for more than 2 decades, we've been at the forefront of advocacy for investments in the modernization of America's aging infrastructure. We actually led a coalition of businesses and other leaders and policymakers and companies across industries of every sector to move forward this very urgent and critical national priority. We're so grateful that the United States Congress passed the historic bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was signed into law, obviously, by President Joe Biden. This once in a generation investment in our nation's infrastructure will rebuild roads and bridges and rails and expand access to clean drinking water and ensure that every American has high access to high-speed internet. And it's going to accelerate a groundbreaking energy innovation push and so much more on the energy front. I'm delighted to have joined me today to have a conversation about what energy means, why is it important in America, and what's included in this historic investment. And I'm happy that my colleague, Chris Gut, Senior Vice President Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Global Energy Institute, has joined me for this very important conversation. Chris, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rick. I'm really happy to be part of this conversation.
Chris, let's jump right in because we have limited time. We often, perhaps some of us may take for granted why energy is so important. I mean, let's level set. Why is energy so important in America? And moreover, this incredible historic once in a generation investment, which we'll talk about in a moment.
It's a very, very timely question, Rick. I mean, if you look at what's happening globally, we're in a spot where the supply of energy is just not keeping up with demand. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine has just exacerbated that. And it's reminded all of us from Europe to Asia, and especially in the US, that energy security is critically important. This focus within the bipartisan infrastructure law is really on developing the technologies of tomorrow that we don't have. And in that way, it's a lot different than some of the other areas within the bill. It does outline about $83 billion dedicated to energy and climate change programming. But I think it's important to take a step back and look at some of the context. The developing world, especially in the U.S., we're moving towards an energy transition, trying to keep the same amount of reliability that we have now, but without any greenhouse gas emissions. But we know from the United Nations itself that roughly 50% of the technologies we'll need to decarbonize the global economy just don't exist yet. And that's why this bill is so important. I mean, the Chamber spent many, many years building strong bipartisan support to address this through U.S. ingenuity, taking advantage of our national labs, and really pushing innovation within the energy sector. And a very sort of underlooked law that passed at the end of 2020 called the Energy Act, it really forged this bipartisan consensus around developing those technologies that we know we're going to need. It's going to take years to do it, but we don't have them yet. And so this legislation really refocuses the Department of Energy and its national labs on developing key technologies necessary to reduce and ultimately eliminate greenhouse gas emissions while preserving economic growth. And within the allotment that DOE gets here, there's $62 billion to accelerate groundbreaking energy innovation, specifically technology around storage, meaning how we can collect electricity when we don't need it, and then deliver it to customers when we do need it, advanced nuclear, and something called carbon capture, utilization, and storage, so that when there is greenhouse gas emissions emitted from a process, we can capture them and they don't go into the atmosphere. Now, it's going to take quite a bit of time for DOE to map out the various work plans, but there will be opportunities for collaboration with businesses and academia on the technology development, as well as states, communities, and tribes to host these new facilities. And it's important to note that there's roughly $40 billion in grant programs that are moving to the states. And so there's lots of opportunities out there for businesses to take advantage of that.
Yeah. Chris, thanks for that wonderful overview. And I want to kind of break down some of those big numbers more specifically. But one of the things you just mentioned, the important role of national labs. Um, Tell me just a minute, what are national labs and how do they work with the private sector in advancing this innovation? You know, one of the big partnerships that we have at the chamber, for example, with our historically Black colleges and universities, they're doing incredible research and innovation. And I'm often asked the question, how do national labs fit in this continuum of innovation and advancing? What we're talking about right here in energy. How do they work?
The national labs are really the crown jewel of energy research around the world. And it's not even just energy research, it's also defense and healthcare. But the 17 labs, they're managed by the Department of Energy through private contracts. And each one of them has a sort of a specific focus, but they all cross train. And they're the tip of the spear when it comes to developing the technologies that we're going to need for tomorrow. And largely they've invented, developed, or perfected all of the energy systems that we're using today. And they are constantly partnering with academia and with the private sector through different programs that Congress creates or the Department of Energy creates in order to bring some sort of goal to bear. In this case, it's developing those technologies that we know we need, but we don't have yet.
And that technology that they're developing and research is sort of commercialized through the private sector. Is that, I mean, sort of that transfer of technology to the private sector for commercialization and ultimately use and impact in our society? Is that right?
Generally, yes, but this bill did something very unique. What Congress did was said, look, we know that the development of these technologies is critically important, but the private sector is very wary of being the first one to build anything. Anytime you have a first of a kind technology, it always takes longer. It always costs more than you anticipate because you don't know what you don't know until you get those engineers and laborers out there, welding and putting circuits where they're supposed to go. So what this bill does is it creates a clean energy demonstration program whereby the Department of Energy will essentially assume the risk. It will build first of a kind technologies in different types of technologies, whether it's carbon capture, advanced nuclear, hydrogen, and then that design and that technology will be open sourced for the private sector to use, but they no longer have that first of a kind risk. So this is a big leap forward as far as Congress telling the Department of Energy that we want the federal government to absorb the risk of the first of a kind effort because we know we have to get over that hump in order to have the private sector start to deploy these technologies.
Well, that's a big deal. That's pretty unique and exciting. A few specific areas I wanted to get your insight on that are very specific. I mean, you talked about the clean energy demonstrations and research hubs and projects, but there's also this interesting line of some $7 billion for grants and prizes for the supply chain for batteries. Talk about that, how that works. I mean, those grants are they loans or how will that process work?
It's a little bit of both, but I think, to give it a little bit of context, there's this significant push to lower emissions in the transportation sector, which produces the most greenhouse gas emissions out of any sector in the economy. And clearly, I think everyone sees that one of the fastest ways to do that is to electrify the transportation sector. Basically, bring electric vehicles into common use across the country. And we've certainly heard the president talk about that as we're struggling with the highest gasoline prices that this country has ever faced. He frequently argues that if we were able to move into an electric vehicle footing, that we would no longer be subject to global prices for oil. And he's certainly right there, but there's a little bit of a problem, and that's the production of these batteries that go into electric vehicles. They require all kinds of unique elements and metals that we really don't produce in this country. Now we have them, but it's almost impossible to site and develop a mine in this country. And so we're almost completely dependent upon other countries. In fact, 95% of these types of elements, things like lithium that go into the batteries that we use in our phones, but also our cars, 95% is controlled by China. both from a production standpoint, but also the processing of those minerals that ultimately go into those batteries. And so what this $7 billion is really designed to do is help create a domestic supply chain. Part of it is focused on how do we better recycle the batteries we have and reuse them again. Part of it is being able to find these elements in sort of what's left over when we mine for others. But increasingly, there's a need and a recognition of a need that we have to be able to mine in this country. And we have the most strict environmental laws, and the mines that we have already that were cited many years ago are the most sustainable mines in the world. And so this is really a focus on Congress, or from Congress, saying we need to develop our own domestic supply chain for these minerals and these batteries. And the Department of Energy is lead in fostering the technologies to recycle, but it's really going to come down to the Department of Interior, who has jurisdiction over the federal lands out west where these mines need to be sited.
One of the questions I get frequently from particularly minority-owned businesses, whether they're Hispanic or Asian American, African American, women-owned, et cetera, is around sort of electric vehicles. But I've got several questions, Chris, around charging stations. Does this investment include funds for the expansion of charging stations? Because there are some companies who are hoping to be able to be a part of that implementation.
Yeah, it absolutely does. It devotes, I think, $7.5 billion at the Department of Transportation to build out charging stations across the country. I mean, we know that public acceptance of electric vehicles is still tenuous. The concept is welcomed by Americans, but they're a little apprehensive about giving up the freedom that they know they have of being able to drive coast to coast and stop at normal gas stations along the way. And so one of the ways to help them get over that trepidation is to be able to have charging stations, going along the interstate so that they know they can stop and charge. And the technology behind charging is growing by leaps and bounds, where there's super fast charging now, where you can in some of these vehicles you can get a full 80% charge in less than 20 minutes. So the goal is to try to put it on par with what you would do if you were stopping to fill with gasoline or diesel. And there's going to be a lot of work with the states as these charging stations get built out. A lot of work with the electric utilities, who ultimately have to provide the electricity that go to these charging stations, and in dozens, if not hundreds, of manufacturers that feed into the technology that is the charging station.
Yeah, Chris, we can't understate the importance of just the whole piece of building resilience of our electric infrastructure against disruptive events. And that's more than just, natural disasters and hurricanes and tornadoes. I'm assuming that's potential threats around cyber and other disruptions, right? Is that right? I mean, this is such an important piece of not just about infrastructure resilience, but our economic viability and sustainability, and to keep our economy and so many other parts of America moving. What's the disruptive event part? Why is that so important?
Yeah, I mean, having the state of technology we do today is really a double-edged sword. I mean, it brings us, the most amazing technologies that mankind has ever been able to experience, whether it's medical or just you and I, looking at a screen and being able to talk to, hundreds of people across the country, something that, I never would have envisioned when I was a kid. The downside is that there are potential vulnerabilities for bad actors to disrupt that. And we certainly saw that last year when the most critical pipeline that delivers gasoline and other fuels in the Mid-Atlantic, in the East Coast, all the way up to New York, it was hacked and it was shut down for several days, and it caused a lot of shortages. There were many gas stations that didn't have fuel, and if you see that happen on a large scale, it really would have a disastrous impact on the economy. Now, the good side, the good angle here is, the electricity sector, the natural gas sector, and the pipeline sector. They're, I would argue, the most advanced sector in the entire economy as far as recognizing this threat years, if not decades ago, and putting in place defenses in order to prevent that from happening. And there's bad actors both from states or countries, as well as third parties who try to interdict and basically cause disruptions in these sectors because they know the impact it'll have on the American economy. And heretofore, they really haven't been successful. But we're at a point now where we've certainly seen threats coming from Russia, and I know that the energy industry is on high alert in order to make sure that there are no disruptions.
Yeah. On another front, I grew up in a rural part of South Carolina, Chris, and when you think of whether it's rural or tribal or even Appalachian or even some urban communities, the area of energy efficiency is really important. I mean, that's where impact can be felt the most. And I notice some of the investments around whether expanding or increasing funding for the weatherization assistance programs and renewable energy improvements at public schools. What are some of the areas like that and others that are impactful that on the efficiency side that included in the Investment Act?
Yeah, that's a great point, Rick. I mean, we know from years and years of data that low-income households and frankly households of color pay a disproportionate share of disposable income on energy. I mean, it's one of those things where you just can't go without. You can't go without electricity. You can't go without heat. And this is especially true in periods like right now, where we have the historically high energy prices. And the bipartisan infrastructure law invests about $3.5 billion in the weatherization assistance program that you mentioned, which is really focused on reducing energy costs for more than 700,000 households. We sometimes don't think about it, but when you're living in a home that might be 50, 60, 100 years old, it's not very efficient, and it takes a lot more energy to heat or cool or power that house. And there are hundreds of programs around the country funded through this weatherization assistance program, where contractors will come out and do like an energy audit, where they'll go through your house and they'll figure out the windows are too old, and we can get some new windows in there that don't lose as much heat, or putting just simple things like insulation that really save Americans a lot of money. Because if you can keep that that heat or that air conditioned air in your house and not have it leak out, then you don't need to run your heater or your air conditioner as much.
Yeah, that and listen, I mean, and that affects the pocketbook every day. I mean, what an extraordinary investment in savings for folks, particularly in those communities. There's funding here for, I think, money for EPA effort for electric buses. So this extends beyond. So when we think of electric vehicles, I thought that was very interesting. That the impact and investment here in buses. I mean, that's so important, obviously, in the transportation of school kids across America, and also some money around a block grant, I believe, program. Is most of this money in the form of block grants to the states, generally speaking, or the competitive grants? How would the flow of the funds for energy, generally speaking, kind of cascade down to local communities?
Yeah, it's really a mixed bag. I mean, there's just so many programs here. I mean, there was a lot of pent up desire to address dozens of problems or opportunities across transportation and telecommunications, and obviously in the energy space. And so there's not a one size fit all, but generally speaking, yes, there are block grants that will be delivered to states or tribes, sometimes communities, and there will be a different application process as you move from state to state to state. But there are competitive angles here too. And this is especially true when you're talking about kind of advanced technologies. And the electric school bus program you're talking about is a good example. This is kind of a nascent technology. We know that lithium-ion batteries work pretty decent in small vehicles like cars, but they're not as we don't know as much about their effectiveness in larger vehicles. And so buses have been electrified much more recent. But we're at a point now where we know that they're reliable, and there's many different manufacturers of them. And this is an opportunity to potentially deliver thousands of electric school buses across the country. And it really prioritizes rural and low-income communities, trying to help those school districts buy clean, zero-emission buses to protect children's health as well as the community.
Thank you. One of the areas that I would tell you that's intriguing to me, I'll be quite candid, and don't know much about is this area of orphan wells and abandoned mines. What's that look like in America? I mean, do we have that many orphan wells and abandoned mines? And what's the investment here to help, I guess, to plug these wells and deal with the abandoned mines?
Yeah, it is definitely an issue, especially in the West for the orphan oil and gas wells, and all over the country for abandoned mines. I mean, part of it is, when we started developing these energy sources, over 100 years ago, we didn't fully appreciate how to care for them after their normal life cycle was extinguished. And so, there are thousands of oil and gas wells that have literally just been left. They need to be plugged and they need to be treated because they're a leading source of methane emissions, which is one of the most potent greenhouse gas emissions there are. And this bill delivers about almost $5 billion in grants to plug these orphan wells throughout the country. Now, when the Department of Interior, who is operating this program, went out for comment or input from states, they had to revise the number of wells that they calculated as having been abandoned to more than double what they originally thought. And so they're working with those states where the highest concentration of these wells are, in order to really get those wells plugged as soon as possible. And similarly, there's over $11 billion for abandoned mines. We rely on minerals for everything. I mean, obviously, we relied on coal as our primary source of electricity for most of the 20th century. Even still today, it provides over 20%. But then, things that we don't always think about, like potash, which is a critical ingredient for all kinds of manufacturing processes, as well as some of these newer minerals that we rely on every day, things like copper and zinc and nickel. And so there's a major commitment to cleaning up some of these areas that just are hazards, both from a physical standpoint and also from an environmental standpoint.
Yeah. Again, what a significant investments that the act includes around energy. Chris, as we wind down, I want to talk a minute or two again about the roles and opportunities for the nation's 8 million plus minority-owned firms to play. As you know, the U.S. Chamber helped lead the effort to codify, for the first time ever, the Minority Business Development Agency, which works with minority businesses. These are important anchors in our communities. They create jobs in their businesses. But how can they get more connected to the information? Presumably, there's guidance coming on a regular basis, I imagine, from the Department of Energy. Should they connect with state and local chambers? Any thoughts on how they can continue to be engaged and involved and be a part, hopefully, of helping to rebuild the energy side of America's infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the authorization and elevation of the Minority Business Development Agency that you mentioned at the Department of Commerce is tremendously beneficial for all of business, but obviously especially minority businesses. And within the energy space, and the environment space, and the climate space, the underlying bipartisan infrastructure bill was very specific about coordination between the agencies. And so as this $83 billion worth of funding is essentially doled out in various forms, either through like the research and development that we talked about at the beginning, or the block grants that we just talked about, that agency, the Minority Business Development Agency, is consulted through the entire process to make sure that those more than 9 million minority-owned businesses that you mentioned are part of the process. And as far as being able to track what the opportunities are, there's a lot of opportunities. So it does take a little bit of effort to track all of them. But I think, to your point, dealing with or interacting with, first and foremost, that Minority Business Development Agency, which has a lot of good information on its website, is a great first step. But within the energy space, the Department of Energy has a very robust website already. They have funding opportunity announcements coming out, seems like monthly. There's a lot of tight deadlines that Congress gave them. So it's something that's worth checking every single day. And the same is true at the Department of Interior and the Environmental Protection Agency. But one area that I think is tremendously beneficial, especially to small businesses, is your local chamber or your state chamber. I mean, they're working with the state, where a lot of these grant programs are pushing money from the federal government to the states, and so they have a much better idea for how to access those funds and how to be a collaborative partner with the state in wherever you live. And so I definitely recommend consulting with your local chamber and your state chamber, because we consult with them and we try to make sure they have all the latest information, so that they can figure out what it means in their state, as those agencies, corresponding agencies, like say a state Department of Energy or a state Environmental Protection Agency, are working with their federal partners here and receiving that money, so they can figure out how best to use it in their states.
Yeah, Chris, one final question as we kind of end this wonderful conversation, and I thank you again. But $83 billion and $1.2 trillion infrastructure investment generally and broadly. How in the world is coordination? I mean, I imagine there had to be some measures around permitting, and how is all this going to be accelerated? And I know it's a long-term investment and for many, many years to come. But how in the world is all of this, the coordination and oversight? How is that going, and how do you see that playing out? I mean, obviously, I've testified on Capitol Hill. I imagine there's a lot of oversight coming from Congress, the president, et cetera. But how do you coordinate something like this and accelerate it and make sure it's impactful to people across America, particularly those who have been in communities that have been left behind?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's a huge sum of money across many agencies, and then every state, hopefully every community. So there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen. We look to some very strong managers at these agencies, starting with the secretaries or the administrators, who are empowered with the trust of the American people, and working with the business community. It's not so much that we're trying to provide oversight. We're just trying to make sure that they have all the best information in real time in the real world, so that they can use those monies as efficiently as possible. You mentioned permitting. I mean, that's something that doesn't get a lot of attention here, but it's very difficult to build things in America. The permitting process has definitely grown beyond its usefulness. It doesn't mean that we don't need it. Of course we do, but we need it to be more efficient. In order to get all of these roads and bridges and transmission lines to bring, renewable sources or nuclear sources of electricity to the grid, we need to be able to build them, and it's almost impossible. And this law does make major steps in trying to streamline that permitting process, which is tremendous. And I think it's worth noting that this law is definitely designed to improve energy and environmental justice for communities across the country. It's going to improve public health, reduce pollution, and frankly deliver economic input and stimulus to communities that often have not been adequately included in the signing process for energy systems. So, as part of the overall coordination, like I said, it's a many eyes on this, both Congress, the business community, and many interest groups across the country. And we within the business community are certainly great partners with the federal government in trying to make sure these programs get implemented as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, without any unintended mistakes.
Yeah. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being here. Again, Senior Vice President Policy here at the U.S. Chamber's Global Energy Institute. It's all about the energy, man. None of it works without energy. And your perspective and your insight and your thoughts here have been extremely valuable. And I thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.